You're running your React app locally on your development server. You open the network tab and you notice that every API call is firing twice and it's the same endpoint with the same payload getting called back to back. Your first instinct is something's probably wrong with React. So you Google it, you open the first Stack Overflow result that pops up. It says that React strict mode intentionally runs your effects twice. The highest voted answer tells you to remove strict mode from the root of your application. You try it and the duplicate API calls disappear. You think the problem is solved and you ship the code. Except you didn't actually solve anything here. Nothing about your effect hook or the business logic changed. You just removed a wrapper that every React sandbox has by default without questioning why it was there in the first place. Because strict mode wasn't causing any bugs. On the contrary, it's actually trying to help you find the bugs that are already there in your system. So, in this video, we're going to understand why React intentionally runs your effects twice in strict mode, what it's actually trying to detect, and more importantly, I'm going to show you a real production bug I ran into because I misunderstood what an effect cleanup was supposed to do, and I could have detected that bug earlier if I had not removed strict mode from my application. But before we go any further, let's clear up the biggest misconception. This duplicate execution never happens in your production build. It's a development only behavior. You will never see duplicate calls once your build actually is deployed. So you might think, if React already knows not to do this in production, why does it still insist on doing it in development? Let's see what's actually happening. With strict mode enabled, when a component mounts for the very first time, React doesn't simply execute your effect once. Instead, it performs this sequence where it first runs your effect setup, immediately runs its cleanup, and then runs the setup one more time. So it goes like this: setup, cleanup, and setup again. Or another way to think about it is, it mounts a component, it unmounts it, and then it mounts it again. And it does this every time in development mode before you've even had a chance to interact with the application. Now, when you first hear about this behavior, it sounds incredibly wasteful. Why would React deliberately do extra work? And the answer is, it's because React is asking your component one very simple question. If I mounted this component, immediately removed it, and then mounted it again, would my application end up in exactly the same state as if I had only mounted it once? If the answer is yes, your effect is written correctly. If the answer is no, strict mode just found a bug in your React code. So now let's go through an example to better understand this concept. Here in this component, we have a fairly normal looking React useEffect hook, which connects to the particular server to fetch information. And it creates a new connection anytime the room ID changes. But if you notice closely, this hook does not have a cleanup method, which you'll also notice that I've put as a comment here at the bottom, that there is a missing return statement, which is also supposed to disconnect the connection created during cleanup. So if we open this chat connection leak component while running it on a dev server on the browser, when the component first mounts, you'll end up with two active connections, and the active connection counts you can see being logged out here. There are two connections because obviously the connection API was called twice, which you can also notice in the network tab. So instead of having the intended single connection, we have two connections on the mount itself. And if we switch between topics, you'll notice that this state switch introduces more active connections. So let me switch between topics again to make this behavior more apparent. And it's these very kind of leaks the rerun is trying to make instantly visible instead of slowly accumulating over hours of actual production users using your application. So to reach our intended behavior and fix this particular issue, I've created this fixed version of this particular component where the use effect is same, but now it also has a cleanup method, which is disconnecting the connection it created in the first place during reruns and unmounts. So if we go back to the browser, refresh the page, and this time I'll open the fixed version of the component. And as you can see, even though the strict mode was enforcing double invocation of the API, the number of active connections is still 1. And even if we switch between topics, the number of API calls increase, but the number of active connections stays 1 itself. So every switch between topics now closes the old connection first before opening the new one, exactly like it should have been doing the whole time. Now the technical term which our use effect is supposed to follow is called idempotency. So any side effect which your hook creates should be idempotent. Now any operation is called idempotent if running the same operation multiple times leaves the system in the final state as running it once. And your effect should have the exact same property. If running setup, cleanup, and setup again produces a different result than just a single setup, then your effect isn't resilient to remounts. And a very good question to ask here is, does this scenario actually even happens in production? And the answer is yes. There are plenty of ways components can remount in production. Maybe the user navigates really fast, they have a slow network, and they click on a button multiple times. Maybe you have conditional rendering in your application, which is triggering remounts, and so on. So, to sum it up, your effects should be idempotent. And I would also like to plug in a video which I made recently where I explained why browsers warn you while you're resubmitting your forms. And the reason behind this is idempotency itself. If the API which invokes when you submit a form is not idempotent, you might end up creating multiple duplicate effects of that API. Maybe that form was supposed to create a transaction and the transaction happened multiple times because of the form submission. So I encourage you to also go watch that video once you finish this. The link to that video should appear on top and I will also post it in the description. So far we have learned that React is replicating remount scenarios every single time during our development, so we can fix bugs which can happen if the cleanup of your effects is not proper. And the example that we saw is a very basic example. So now let me show you a real example from an application I worked on. This was an actual dashboard I created in production, and to demo that bug I've created this basic replica of that very dashboard. Let me first show the working version of this particular dashboard. When I click on one of these rows, a details page opens showing the information about that specific record. Now the details page needs to know which row I clicked, so naturally I stored the selected row ID inside Redux, and to me that sounded perfectly reasonable. And when the component unmounts, I dispatch another action that clears the selected row from Redux. So if I click on go back to dashboard, you'll see that the row ID is now null. But when I was running this app locally, it wasn't working as intended. So let me now open this buggy version. I'll select a row, and as you can see, the selected row ID was still null. So what I did, I just closed off StrictMode, and now if we click on a row, the row ID was actually stored and I was able to render the order details. So while doing development for this particular dashboard, I had strict mode turned off the entire time. So even though strict mode helped me in detecting the bug early on, I chose to ignore it and I pushed this buggy dashboard into production. So to now debug this, let's go through the buggy component first. Here is the use effect, which is the culprit. Here, as you can see, when the component unmounts, I dispatch another action that clears the Redux state. And I did this because once a details page had closed, I did not want stale data hanging around in global state. So once the user clicks the row, I set the row ID and this component mounts. The order details are fetched based on that particular row ID, and once I go back to the dashboard, I clear the row ID. It was that simple. But now if I enable strict mode, watch what happens. Once React first mounts this component, it unmounts it immediately running the cleanup method. So now the row ID which I had initially set in Redux is now cleared, and when React remounts this component, row ID is basically undefined. So my use effect is not idempotent. There's nothing here which sets the row ID again. And this happened because I set the row ID in Redux while I clicked a row on the dashboard, and that was the bad code which I had implemented. The original state was never set inside this use effect, so cleaning it did not make any sense. And because of this bug, my page stops working. Anything inside this component that depended on the selected row ID simply stops rendering. And at first I thought it's because of strict mode that it's happening, but it was strict mode which exposed that my state model was wrong. That row ID was never really global application state, it was navigation state. Its lifetime should have been tied to the route itself. The correct solution here was moving that ID into React router. So in the fixed version of this particular application, you will notice that I'm passing the ID in the application route itself. So this ID will persist as long as this route exists, and even if due to some unpredictable problem, if this component remounts, because of this ID being present in the route, we will always be navigated to the details of this particular row ID. So if you see this fixed version of this hook, the row ID which this component is receiving is coming from the use navigate hook of React router. And once you understand this concept of your effects being idempotent, you will start noticing similar kinds of issues everywhere. Maybe you have missing WebSocket cleanups, maybe your intervals which got initiated in the effect never stopped running. Maybe there are event listeners which are getting registered multiple times because there is no cleanup. To give a few examples. Now they are all different symptoms, but they're caused by the exact same assumption that an effect gets only one clean uninterrupted lifetime. So the next time you open your network tab and see duplicate API requests in development, do not get worried. It's React trying to help you in detecting bugs. It's really okay if network calls are happening twice and there is no buggy behavior in your application. And keep this as a best practice of never removing strict mode while you're doing development. And that was it for this video. I really do hope you guys learned something new today. And if that's the case, please hit on the like button. And I'm regularly making videos on advanced React topics. So if you're interested in that, subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you guys in the next one.